which is on under the table there. They're on? Oh, there we go. Sometimes they have a delay. It's like they want to get warmed up of a morning or just before a meeting. So I appreciate the, for me, an early hour because you're normally in here at 7 and I still didn't make it at 8. So we chose to not concur with the bill that we did have a lot of discussion of whether or not we should declare it materially altered, and we decided not to do that. We'd let things play out as they play out. And as we go through the bill, and staff has a side-by-side comparison of the bill that was passed out in 2019 that ended up being gutted on the House floor for Medicaid expansion, so it went nowhere, and then the current bill. So you have that to pass out. We noticed that there was a lot of changes in that bill. So my first question for you, Mr. Chairman, is what was the hearing process on this bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair or Representative Landwehr. The process was we had a hearing on a similar bill last session, and then this session we had a 454. I got together with some of the conferee's proponents and told them I wanted a condensed bill because all we're doing is removing a collaborative practicing agreement. And they worked on that over the off session and came back with 454 toward the end. We had a hearing on the original bill scheduled, not really a hearing, but a informational. And then we allowed a short, brief hearing on 454, which allowed an opponent and a proponent to speak, and then we took action.
Well, my comment would be it shows that it wasn't vetted through a strong process of a hearing. And I think when you look at the sheet, the side-by-side comparison sheet, you can see a whole lot of things that were left out, and I think that that's where we run into problems. The first thing that, let's see, because, all right, let's just go through this here. Is there continuing?
Representative Landwehr, if I could just make one comment about that. You said it wasn't vetted, and you gave me this side by side, and I really appreciate it. The Senate's position was 454, not the House version that got gutted. And each proponent and opponent had a 5-day notice of what we were going to do. The opponent did not bring anything up on this issue. So they did have an opportunity. They did not bring it up. I just wanted to clarify that.
That's fine. Thank you. Is there, because I just could not find it, is there any continuing education for opioid prescriptions in this bill?
I would refer to our revisor on that.
Mr. Abbott or Jenna, whichever. I think Jenna's on the Senate. And
thank you, Mr. and Madam Chair, I guess. Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. Senate substitute for House Bill 2279 does not make any changes to continuing education requirements for advanced practice registered nurses.
all right, thank you. Then I also have is, are they required to participate in the KTRAX program? I guess you can refer to Jenna each time, or I can, however you'd like to do it, Senator.
Well, probably to save a couple of steps on these technical issues, we'll just defer everything to the revisor.
We're fine. Just take your time. this will not be the only time I'm sure that we meet. So. And I believe that we've both got 9 o'clock commitments. Is that correct?
Again, Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. So the bill references that an APRN prescribing under this act would be required to do so in accordance with the Uniform Controlled Substances Act, which does, what? Yeah. Yes, they're not required to access it, but they would be required to.
Good morning, everyone. Scott Abbott, Revisor Statutes Office. So current law in KTRACS requires that dispensers submit information to KTRACS, does not impose a requirement on practitioners to access KTRACS. So although an APRN, if they were given authority to prescribe drugs, they would fall within the framework of KTRACS, those requirements would not be imposed on them.
Then that would lead me to a question of, are they allowed to dispense as a physician is allowed to dispense?
So, again, Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. Under the provisions of the bill, this would be lines 33 and 39. An advanced practice registered may prescribe, procure, and administer any drug. It does not allow dispensing in this bill.
So then how does, because and I guess another question I have is a collaborative agreement still allowed under this bill?
Thank you, Mr. and Madam Chair. Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. The bill eliminates the requirement for a collaborative practice agreement, and eliminating that from current law would make it up to the individual advanced practice registered nurse and physician. If they wanted to enter into an agreement like that, it would not be prohibited.
And how does this bill show a designation that this is an APRN in independent practice according to what you say this bill has versus one that is under a collaborative agreement?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The bill does not speak to that.
And anywhere in this bill, does it reference at least one statute, 651113, which is in the Nurses Practice Act?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. Based upon my reading of the bill and a quick control find, that statute is not mentioned in the 2279.
Would it be the revisor's opinion as attorneys that without that, this bill does not allow independent practice? Would that be correct? And Jen, if it's easier with Scott, it doesn't make us any difference, whatever you guys want to do with it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think without addressing those definitions in 651113, it leaves some ambiguity in the state of the law as to a potential conflict between the provisions in existing law.
So I guess, Senator, what we're trying to figure out is what do you actually have in this bill? Because I think I'm hearing our revisers say one thing and the proponents of this bill saying something else when I visit with them. And if you don't want to answer right now, I've thrown a lot of information out there. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Representative Landwehr. And maybe a question for Scott. He said possible ambiguity and conflict. So would a solution to take out that ambiguity and conflict, just to revise that, make a revision to reference 65-1113 in this current bill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I think if there is any potential for confusion between 65-1113 and what the bill would do, the best course would be to make amendments to 65-1113 to make them conform and consistent with one another.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative.
So how would you like to proceed, Senator?
Is that the only concern that the House has on this bill? Or?
No, I've got a lot of concerns on that, but I know that we're limited time today. So
I'd as far as I'd go ahead and continue is what I would like to do until we run out of time and get all the questions brought up and addressed.
you guys can hand this out. And the way that I operate, Senator, is I like to be, straight up with things. And it's the House position that at this time what we've just handed out to you would be an amendment. And I believe that you saw something similar on the Senate floor during your debate that was offered. I might note that in the bill from 2019, the words medicine and surgery were in that bill multiple times. And if you go into the definition of the Kansas Nurses Act, Practice Act, medicine and surgery is mentioned in here multiple times as well. It's not something we just, came up with. So.
Sure, Madam Chair. You mentioned House position. What was the vote when you guys voted on this bill on the floor?
Well, you sent us a Senate substitute, so we just non-concurred.
Okay, I apologize. On 2000, the bill back that you keep referencing.
Oh, in 2019,
Yes.
we did not have debate on the floor because a gut and go was done to make it a Medicaid expansion bill. And I don't know what the vote was coming out of the Health and Human Services Committee. I've slept since 2019.
Sure. And Madam Chair, with all due respect, the Senate does have a pretty strong position on this. It actually passed our Senate 30-7. We did bring up this amendment and it failed pretty significantly. So our position will not change on that.
Well, then that's probably a shame. Well, no, it is. Isn't probably, it is a shame. Because apparently they thought it was good enough in 2019. I actually had a couple of the APRN lobbyists in discussions with me and my leadership team. And when we pointed out some of these different things that I pointed out to you, the comment was, well, it may get settled by a court. Do the APRNs realize that they will probably end up in court with this bill if it passes and is signed by the governor? I've never had a lobbyist tell me that before, that the bill may be bad enough to end up in court.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that insight. I know that's nothing that had been ever relayed to the Senate position or Senate side. I guess my only comment, I don't know what the context was because I was not in that conversation, but any bill that legislation passes is liable to end up in court if someone doesn't like it. But I don't know if that was the context or what the context was. Again, that's, this is the first that we've heard about it. So just have to take your word on the context of that. So.
All right. Let me go through a couple other questions so we can get some of them out of the way. Is what drugs may an APRN prescribe pursuant to 2279?
And I will defer to Jenna, our revisor.
Thank you, Mr. and Madam Chair, Gentleman Revisor Statutes Office. There are not specific limits on any drugs mentioned in the bill. The language is that an APRN would be allowed to prescribe, procure, and administer any drug consistent with such licensee's specific role and population focus, except that an APRN would not be allowed to prescribe any drug intended to cause an abortion. So it would be based upon the specific credentialing and national certification, what drugs would be within their scope of practice to prescribe.
Are there limitations on opioids in this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only limitation on controlled substances would be that any drug that's a controlled substance would be required to be prescribed in accordance with the Uniform Controlled Substances Act. And there are specific limitations based upon the class and category of controlled substances in that act.
So with that answer there, and then the answer that you provided earlier on the K-tracks, then we would have someone possibly prescribing opioids that would not be required to report to K-tracks. Is that correct?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's the dispenser that reports to K-tracks, and APRN would not be allowed to dispense drugs. And so, as Scott mentioned earlier, the prescriber is not required to report to K-tracks, but that would also be the case for physicians as well.
And then what are the guardrails within this bill to determine that APRNs are prescribing properly within their scope?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Gentleman Revisor Statutes Office. The guardrails would be based upon the specific regulations adopted by the Board of Nursing, and then their authority and discretion to provide professional discipline if a prescriber if an APRN had a complaint against them or other administrative action.
Okay. And I think probably one last question here, or at least I can think of right this moment, is it so? It's your position, Senator, that 2279 does not expand the scope of practice for an APRN. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct.
And listening to what the revisers have told us, that everything would refer back to our laws. I will once again point out in the Nurse Practice Act 651113, and I think that's only one of them that would have to be opened up, but at least that one would have to be opened up in order to provide them to open up their direct care underneath it from outside of a collaborative agreement. I've only had one cup of coffee. I'm just telling you, Senator.
Madam Chair, you're ahead of me. I'm still on my first count, so.
Ooh, we're doing dangerous today.
Yeah, so hold on tight. No telling where we're going here, but if it would be okay with the chair of the House, if we requested the revisers, we're going to run out of time before we can come to an agreement for sure. Have the revisers look and do a search of how many statutes this would be in conflict with and what we would need to revise to make sure that there is no ambiguity, and then maybe address it at that point.
Well, perhaps I didn't make myself clear. I came with one amendment and one amendment only. And that was actually offered up before we chose to concur or non-concur on the bill. And that's the one you just told me that is not an option to be put into the bill. Yet they put it in there in 2019.
Madam Chair, that is correct. 2019, we did not have a bill in the Senate. The Senate's position was without this, and on the floor, this amendment, same amendment was offered, and it was soundly defeated. So we would not be willing to accept this amendment.
Are the APRNs, is there a minimum set in this bill for their malpractice insurance like it is for physicians in statute?
I will defer to the reviser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jen Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office. There's not a specific amount mentioned in 2279 for malpractice insurance.
Would they be included in the healthcare stabilization fund like physicians?
Madam Chair, they would not. And then maybe a question on that answer from the revisers. Does the Board of Nursing have the ability through rules and regs to put a minimum standard on malpractice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That topic is not specifically addressed in statute, although the Board of Nursing is allowed rules and regs authority, so presumably they could adopt a regulation requiring a specific amount.
I think that's a major concern. If I was an APRN, I'd be worried about that in my business. And that was an act that was put back in place in 1980, and it's been a huge asset, I think, for the medical area for our physicians.
Madam Chair, that was a topic of great discussion when we were debating it on the floor, and actually in our caucus meeting. Nurses, APRNs currently have malpractice, and in other states they currently have it. And once they have been removed from the collaborative practice agreement in other states, that those rates have not changed. Comparatively to a doctor, the malpractice rates are fairly reasonable. And that's something, especially on the floor debate, we talked about, are we going to give a litmus test to everybody that wants to go into business on whether or not they can afford whatever they're going to do? Because whether or not you go into business for anything, you have to have liability insurance. That's part of your cost. And we do not go through a litmus test to make sure other people can afford their liability insurance. That's something on them to figure out. And if we get into whether or not each business can afford to go into business for themselves, I think we're doing an injustice to our small business people.
Well, and I don't believe that that's where I'm at. I'm stating that they are in the healthcare field and we have a minimum, because we don't even know what the minimum is going to be for the APRNs, do we, Sen?
At this point, we do not.
One of the other things I might point out in the bill from 2019 is that they had the board shall adopt rules and regulations establishing a program of transition to full practice as an APRN. And an APRN who has less than 4,000 hours of licensed active practice as an APRN under collaborate with this subsection shall be required to undergo a transition program. There's no guardrails whatsoever for that transition. And that concerns me. And it's like I asked the question the other day of someone. I said, all right, let's look at this. And I guess I should have brought my little spreadsheet wheel. And I bet I can have that for our next meeting, or would be happy to send it to your offices. That if you wanted to deal with someone just coming out of school, so you have an APRN and you have a physician, which one brand new out of school would you go to? This one's got several thousand hours in residency. This one here is about 700 hours, and maybe they did some practice within all of that, but nothing to the level of a physician. Because we're not talking about APRNs that have been in practice under a collaborative agreement for the last 15, 20 years. Because those that have been under that are probably capable to do a lot of things that they talk about, but not brand new out of school. They're not ready for that. And when I talked to the physicians, several physicians across the state this last weekend, the APRNs are an asset to them. And I know that you've kind of made it your mission, Mr. Chairman, to get rid of turf battles, and that will never happen in the area of healthcare. It just doesn't. They'll find something new. because now the PAs are coming next year. They want direct access. We've got the AACRNA issue. So we could address all of these here at once. But that's not what people want to do. And the very people that are supporting this APRN bill are opposing the AACRNA legislation. So I take, and I'm sure that you do too, the health care of our constituents very seriously. And I think that this creates not only a problem, I think, for the potential harm to constituents, but there's going to be an innocent APRN that gets caught up in this mess because it was rushed too fast. And I have, I've got, I'd have to go back and look, but probably about 12 years of experience just with health and human services, and that doesn't count the social services side of things. And I've never drafted a bill of this magnitude. I've passed bills like the corporate practice of medicine, direct access for PTs. We just kicked out the OT yesterday. We've done the pharmacy bill with the Kroger's and the CVS's, all of them with the pharmacists. And that legislation was written by the two sides, not by legislators, because I'm not the expert in healthcare by any means at all. And I know that some folks are like, well, KMS will never agree. You're right, they will never agree. But they have at least tried to offer up some language, which is being directly refused to put in there. Does that mean that I would personally concur with this bill and vote with it just because that language goes in there? No, Senator. I will not vote for this bill. Because when I look at what went out of the Health and Human Services Committee in 2019 and I look at today, it's a pretty skimpy bill. And there's a reason. It raises a lot of questions and puts a lot of questions on the table. So I think, I've probably given you here a lot of things to think about and some things that we probably can't say in public to each other right now. But I hope that, and if you've got questions for me, I'm happy to answer them for you as well, Senator.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I do. You brought up some interesting points, and one thing I've learned, and I've not privy to the tenure that you are here under this dome, but my short time here, I've come to the realization that each individual legislator and each individual chair of committee does things differently. Does not mean that one is doing it right and the other is doing it wrong. I will tell you that when I looked at this bill, and the APRNs came to me and they brought me the first bill, I said, why is all this stuff in here? We're talking about a piece of paper, collaborative practice agreement. If that is truly what we are talking about, we do not need all this stuff in here. We need a collaborative practice agreement. Gone. You made a comment that well-being of others could be in jeopardy with this, and because of the minimum hours. My question to you is, that's already happening today. What issues have been brought up that their health has been jeopardized? There are many APRNs that are practicing without a doctor present. They have a collaborative practice agreement. What changes? What all of a sudden makes that now a jeopardy to the health of Kansans by just removing that piece of paper? What's the difference? That would be my question back to you.
Under the, it's more than just a piece of paper, a lot more than a piece of paper. And sometimes up here, people will try to simplify things that are actually pretty complicated. It's like the discussion of alcohol from a liquor store into a store. It's more than just switching from one shelf to another shelf, because the complexity within our laws is massive. Alcohol happens to be the most regulated product in the state of Kansas over a whole lot of other things. I think we have the same thing here, is that under their scope, whether they have a physician on site or they don't, they are limited to what that physician allows them to do. If they go beyond that, then they're jeopardizing or violating their collaborative agreement. And I do know in talking to a lot of doctors that have got 20 and 30-year APRNs will tell you that they do allow them to do a whole lot of things, but they're always still available. That physician is always still available, whether it's by phone or it's in person. That physician also carries some liability for the actions of that individual, unless they step outside of their scope. If they step outside of the scope that the physician allowed them under that collaborative, so it's more than just a piece of paper. They've made it as if it's just a piece of paper, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Because even employees of a hospital or of a clinic under a collaborative agreement still pays a fee for that collaborative agreement. And there were offers over the last 2 or 3 years that let's look at fixing the collaborative agreement. Because you're right, that's what they complained about in the whole, in their testimony on a regular basis was the collaborative agreement. And we were trying to find some compromise on that, and they didn't want to hear it, Senator. So it's more than a piece of paper.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that insight. I guess my question back to you then would be, does a doctor grant under a collaborative practice agreement, a APRN has a specific scope of what they went to school for, their training. Does a doctor give them the ability to operate outside of that scope? So, for example, an APRN went for mental health. Can they then, if that was their scope of practice and their specialty, can a doctor allow them and give them the ability to practice outside of that scope, maybe in family practice medicine?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can go back and get it.
So my point with that question, Madam Chair, is they have a defined scope of practice with or without a collaborative practice agreement. All we are going to do is say, remove that collaborative practice agreement, and you can still operate under your scope without that collaborative practice agreement. We are not saying that they can operate outside of it. So a APRN specialty in mental health can't go in and do family practice medicine.
Senator, can you provide me in writing the scope of practice for each one of the APRN professions?
I cannot, but the Board of Nursing could.
Because that was another thing that was brought up in discussions over the last few years on this is let's put their scope into statute. Let's define the scope.
Is it defined now?
I don't believe it is in statute, Senator.
That's what, we're not changing their scope. So if it's not defined in statute now, it's defined under the Board of Nursing. If we're not changing their scope, why would we define it in statute?
Supervisor Abbott, did we find a definition for the scope of practice for nurses anywhere in statutes or rules and regs for each one of the levels of an APRN?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I understand it's kind of difficult to describe it in terms of scope of practice because there's disagreement about what that even means. I will say that in statute and in rules and regulations, there is reference to what a nurse or an advanced practice registered nurse may do, varying depending on the role that they specialize in, typically referring to their training and education.
But it's not detailed. You can't produce a list for me to look at and say this is the scope of one that specializes in mental health, etc.
When you say list, there is nothing I can find that lists, for example, these are the specific tasks that an APRN may perform.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, one of the good things about having more than one person on your side is you get questions. And obviously this question is very valuable because my ranking and vice chair both want me to ask this question. So their question is it written specifically for each MD specialization? Are those written in statute or in rules and regs somewhere?
Scott?
Madam Chair, it is not.
Shall we compare the hours, Senator, of a family physician and a APRN and their education process?
Madam Chair, I don't believe that's the point. The point was made that each has their own scope of practice. They have their own profession that they went to school for. Neither one of them is going to operate outside of it. A doctor of mental health is not going to perform brain surgery no more than an APRN of mental health is going to perform family health.
Well, I think that, again, and I'm going to go back to this here, is the definitions in the Nurses Practice Act is basically the language I'm asking for in this amendment. And the Senate doesn't even want to entertain that. And there's not clear definitions of what surgery is, Senator.
Madam Chair, with all due respect, the Senate did entertain that and we voted it down.
Then we may reach a point to where we'll just let the bill do what it does. And I'm going to state very clearly in here that this bill does not allow for independent practice. It does not remove the collaborative agreement, which is stated in the Board of Nursing Practice Act. They don't even want to put their own language in here, Senator. That's really raising some red flags. You heard that there is concern of it not being really clear on what their prescriptive authority is in this. I could not pass a bill like this anywhere in clear conscience, knowing that there's major problems in this bill. And I'm fully aware of the fact that a concur is in motion at all times. I'm kind of sad that a health bill is being played with politics. I don't like that on healthcare bills. Never had to do it. So if a concur is their answer, then that's up to them. I can't stop someone from doing that. They can clearly do that. And then we'll make all of these points here that's not in the bill. Even things that are currently in statute that are not in the bill. And I will feel very sad when an APRN gets wrapped up in court because he or she did something this bill does not say they have the permission to do under law.
Madam Chair, the only thing that I would throw back your direction would be is I don't believe anybody on the Senate side, I don't know if this was directed to us, playing politics with healthcare. That is not our goal over on this side. Our goal is that we want to provide better access care to Kansans, especially in rural Kansas. And we see this as a viable option for those living in rural Kansas. Me personally, I do not have a doctor in my community. All I have is an APRN. I go see an APRN for the things that an APRN is allowed to do. I understand what their scope of practice is when I go there. He lets me know whether or not I need to go see somebody else or he can refill my high blood pressure medicine, which I'm not sure why I have to
take that. Is that what
take
you're
that.
telling me, Senator?
Oh, no. No shade was thrown your way on that. But no politics is being played on this side, and I hope that was not the intent of what your comment was, because we are just looking out for the well-beings of Kansas.
I also find it interesting, Senator, you asked if we would entertain maybe putting some of that 651113 in here. The amendment that I'm offering comes from that 651113 that you just said that the Senate shot down. So there wouldn't even be an option to do anything with 651113 or any of the other statutes that address medicine and surgery within the Nurse Practice Act.
Madam Chair, let me clarify that suggestion. The suggestion was to give you ease of mind. I am okay with the way the bill is written. The amendment that you have given me does not address 651113 either. Nowhere in it does it reference 651113. My offer to ease your mind was to amend 65-1113 or any other statute to conform with our current bill as written. And I do apologize if that was misinterpreted.
I appreciate the clarification. Thank you, Senator. So I think what we'll do at this time here is go back and we visit with our colleagues. And like I said, should someone here the next day or two pop up and say they want to do a concur, then we let the chips fall where they fall. But if you feel like there is somewhere that you want to move forward on this bill, maybe possibly consider the amendment that I've offered. And again, even with this amendment, I'll make it very clear, I will not support this bill. I will make the same points on the House floor as I'm making in here today. Because I want the intent spelled out very, very clear as to what's in this bill and what's not in this bill. And I think we've done that today. Now, is everything in, have I gone through everything that's not in this bill that should be? No. I've just hit on one piece of it. So you might, keep in touch. Let me know if you have a change of heart at any point. And we can call another conference committee at that time.
Madam Chair, we do appreciate that, and that offer extended to you as well. And we do appreciate you calling a conference committee and having at least an opportunity to air our differences and try to come to an agreement. But it seems like the sticking point is that amendment. So we will part ways unless somebody comes up with a different view of where we're at right now. So thank you again.
One thing I might add, and again, it goes back to 24 years of experience in this building. Drawing a line in the sand, it can get pretty dangerous. And I've never had to draw a line in the sand. Because when they say that there was no compromise, I came off of this being underneath the Board of Healing Arts, and I think it's 2 states that may have that. So there was a big chunk of my compromise right there. This is the next one that I'm asking for. And when I look at the bill from 2019 and the bill that we have today, they understood that then, but apparently they don't understand it now. So, all right, perhaps I'll hear from you later today or tomorrow.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
And thank you to the staff.